Well, g'day and welcome to my last show for 2024. It's another big one and you won't want to miss a thing. I've got a few things to say about the terrible anti-Semitism, the terrorism that the Albanese government is fostering here in our nation. I used to think it was the worst government since Whitlam, but now I think it is right up there with the worst government since Federation. The Albanese government pours petrol on the hateful fire of anti-Semitism in the same way it pours the petrol of reckless government spending on the dumpster fire of inflation that it's created. I'm sorry, folks, but the news going into Christmas is not good, but awareness of the damage must provoke us to vote them out when we get the chance next year. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, and in a moment I'll talk to a great Australian, Professor David Flint, about the hope of Christmas and why it can be good news for Australian politics. And speaking of hope, I want to get a bit philosophical and discuss one of the leading lights of the public discourse. And I'm speaking of Dr. Jordan Peterson. Now, I won't have him on the show, but I've got someone who's a great defender of Jordan Peterson, Rohan McHugh, who's a good friend. He's with John Anderson Media and is well placed to talk about what Peterson is saying. You won't want to miss the discussion that Rohan and I will have in just a moment. Kirralie Smith will also be along for our last gender reveal of 2024. All that and more. Don't touch that dial. Well, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong must be condemned for their abandonment of Israel. By supporting UN resolutions that undermine Israel's sovereignty and promote a Palestinian state run by anti-Semitic terrorist supporters, Labor is not just turning its back on a key ally, it is inviting terrorism and fueling anti-Semitic violence here in Australia. The shocking arson attack on Melbourne's Adass Israel synagogue on Friday tragically underscores the consequences of such misguided policies. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned just hours before the attack that Australia's shift at the UN would invite more terrorism and anti-Semitic riots in Western cities, including Australia. His words proved devastatingly prophetic. This deliberate attack on a place of worship is a stark reminder of the dangers of emboldening extremist ideologies, particularly Islamist ideology. As Cameron Stewart pointed out in The Australian, the Palestinian Authority is wholly incapable of governing a state, describing the PA as corrupt and anti-Israel. That's an understatement. The Palestinian Authority's long-standing practice of paying salaries to terrorists and embracing atrocities like the October 7 massacres disqualifies it as a partner, as a credible partner for peace. This should be obvious to Albanese and his Foreign Minister Penny Wong. Who do they think will run this state that they insist at the UN must be created? The only candidates for leadership are fanatics who want a second Holocaust of the Jews from the river to the sea. Netanyahu's office rightly criticised the Albanese government's actions as a reward for terrorism. The Prime Minister's willingness to appease globalist forces at the UN and extremist imams in Western Sydney comes at the expense of Australia's Jewish community and our broader social harmony. Family First, the political party I have the privilege of leading, unequivocally condemns Labor's complicity in normalising anti-Semitism and compromising our national security. Jewish organisations have warned of escalating Jew hatred on Australian streets. The Melbourne synagogue attack confirms these fears. As Zionist Federation President Jeremy Liebler stated, and I quote, "This violent attack is a direct consequence of words turning into actions." The Albanese government's support for resolutions at the UN targeting Israel sends a dangerous message to anti-Semitic actors, and that message is that violence pays. The Albanese government must reverse its dangerous foreign policy direction, but of course it won't. Netanyahu's words resonate powerfully. Supporting the Palestinian Authority with statehood invites more terrorism and endangers lives. That has played out in an act of vile anti-Semitism on the streets of Melbourne just last Friday. We are being governed by people who do not understand the nature of Islamist terror. Our Jewish community is paying the price, but anyone who thinks the terrorists will only come for the Jews is a fool. Well, I want to get into something that's a bit philosophical, so bear with me. I want to grapple with some of the ideas of the great Jordan Peterson, and in a moment I'll bring in my friend, a guest, Rohan McHugh, who is media director at johnanderson.net.au. Now, Peterson has risen to become one of the world's most influential public intellectuals with his message that life is tough, get over it, and embrace responsibility and life as an adventure. Now, this has resonated with young men in particular, but young people everywhere. Peterson's assertion that truth can be wrestled with and found in the great stories of the West has made him an enemy of our woke elites who reject the idea of truth and the idea that Western civilization is exceptional. He further offends them by demolishing their postmodern ideas of reality, as he did in this video in 2018, the video that made him famous.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
But it's not just the woke left that Peterson has offended. Increasingly, the libertarian right and those who see themselves as guardians of a version of classical liberalism that upholds individual freedom and autonomy are also upset with him. His talk via video link to the recent Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference in Sydney attracted criticism from quarters that should be aligned with the ARC vision for smaller government, economic prosperity and freedom from woke tyranny. Roger Partridge, the founder and chairman of the New Zealand Initiative, a brilliant centre-right economic think tank based in Wellington, said Peterson's talk at Sydney's ARC conference amounted to a direct assault on individual autonomy, the cornerstone of classical liberalism, end quote. Now, I'm a big fan of ARC, which was founded by the former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson, the UK's Baroness Philippa Stroud and Peterson himself. Others were involved, but they're the three sort of main movers. Now, I was privileged to attend the inaugural ARC conference in London last year, and I was at the recent Sydney event, which upset Roger Partridge, who, as I say, should be someone on board with the ARC agenda, which is pushing back against our globalist elites who seem hell-bent on managing the decline of the West. Here's what upset Partridge. It's Peterson's insistence that, and I quote, people who attempt to find their redeeming identity in their own fragmented individuality will fail, Jordan Peterson says, and that we find our purpose only through sacrifice of narrow self-interests to family, community, and ultimately the state. As a classical liberal, Partridge is riled by this, and he thinks the individual should be preeminent and not responsible to family, community and even the state. Here's a sample of what Peterson said at the ARC conference in Sydney recently, which so upset some on the libertarian right.
And we're called upon, in the deepest sense, as people who presume a certain role of leadership, to be faithful and motivating scouts of the future, and to have faith in our ability, working collectively, making the proper sacrifices, adopting the appropriate responsibility to make the future a place of promise and abundance, fortified with the notion that if we conduct ourselves according to the highest ethical principles, that there's no desert that we can't make bloom.
Now, here's where I want to bring in my guest, Rohan McHugh, who, as I said before, is media director for johnanderson.net.au. Rohan, welcome to the show. You defended Jordan Peterson in a brilliant article in The Australian recently. Why do classical liberals on the right, like Partridge, get so riled up about Peterson's idea that there is more to us than our individual autonomy?
I think they get riled up because their political philosophy may not be delivering a fruitfulness that they hoped it would continue to deliver. That was part of my contention when I wrote the piece. I thought Roger Partridge was saying some very wise things, but I felt that his approach was limited because I don't think that he was able to convincingly give a kind of moral framework that has been part of the West for many centuries now, that I would say is a requirement if we do wish to continue in on the trajectory that we have been, and to benefit from the fruitfulness that the institutions and individual commitment to virtue has conferred.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because it seems like there are a lot of people who would probably be allies of the ARC agenda and allies of people like you and I, but they're perhaps wanting to, as I say, it said in the introduction, highlight the individual, but downplaying, the bigger story. Now, Peterson talks a lot about archetypes, and he uses biblical stories to do so. Now, in your piece, you wrote that the classical liberal framework brackets out metaphysical commitments. Now, a warning, I said this was going to be a little bit philosophical for our viewers. What is it about the metaphysical which seems, which is, that's a reference to things that are beyond science. What is it about the metaphysical that is so important for us to recover, and that perhaps what people like Roger Partridge are missing?
Yeah, so I there am referring to the work and the commentary of a political philosopher called John Rawls. And one of his proposals is that we do indeed need to bracket out metaphysical commitments, if we want to take liberalism and to make it as successful as possible. And I'm simply pointing out that I think Roger Partridge was doing the same thing. The think tank that he represents is a secular one, but I don't think that is conducive with the Western history that we all enjoy or are all part of. And I would say that the metaphysical commitments indeed give you the moral structure, give you the kind of institutions, give you that scaffolding that allows us to keep something alive that is desperately needed if we want to continue to enjoy the fruitfulness that we have enjoyed for many, many years. So we are at a strange turning point where people are starting to see that liberalism as a political philosophy cannot do all the heavy lifting it needs to guarantee, or to at least provide the conditions that will see us to prosper. And so my piece just wants to draw attention to that and say there's just a few missing pieces here that Jordan Peterson is, I think, very helpfully tapping into. I mean, this man, it doesn't consider himself religious, but he does acknowledge through archetypes the representations of what these stories and these lessons provide us. And he's saying we cannot lose those, because people don't realize that they're kind of cutting off the branch that they're sitting on. This is not something that you can simply, move past and then be on the right side of history in overcoming. It's the very thing that we need to have that kind of prosperity and that kind of, the conditions that we enjoy.
Yeah, look, a lot of liberals, secular liberals, liberals not in the left-wing sense, but in the classical liberal sense, are people who perhaps don't go along with the Christian narrative. But it seems like Peterson is trying to say, as you're saying, that we can't divorce ourselves from those archetypes. And perhaps you could explain what archetypes mean, but I think he's referring to the ability to discover truth through narrative and story, and the stories that we've inherited in the West, which have essentially come from the Judeo-Christian heritage that we share.
That's right. I mean, and he applies this Jungian framework. He's an acolyte of Carl Jung, and in doing so, he basically wants to bring order in the midst of chaos. And archetypes are the mechanism that he would say accomplish that. It's the symbols, the metaphors, those sorts of things that cut across all civilizations, that are universally understood. And then you have these symbolic representations in forms like, the mother or the warrior or the sage, different kind of categories that he thinks you can find. And so he's not approaching it from a theological standpoint necessarily, but he is acknowledging that the Western tradition is thoroughly Christian, and it doesn't matter in Peterson's mind that it is true, that is to say, concretely, historically true, because he sees truth more as what is pregnant with the kind of meaning that sustains us. And so he's saying that it needs to be reckoned with, and classical liberalism is kind of sort of saying this pluralistic approach to things where we just have a melting pot of different, disparate positions, theologies, cultures, and all kinds of various things can just be harmonized because we have this bedrock of agreed upon jurisprudence or sort of legal philosophy, and we can have people just through iron sharpening iron work it all out and improve each other. But when it comes to the pluralizing of those bedrock beliefs, then you start getting into trouble, because you start to say, well, we can no longer rely upon people saying, I'm going to park my metaphysical commitments or theological, cultural commitments. We're bringing all of that, and then you actually start to say, well, now there's deeper questions about what it means to be human. It's not merely about the particulars of how we sort of function at the edges. It's what about the bedrock questions needs to be challenged, because this is what I truly believe as an individual or a particular group. And so expressions of that would be, of course, multiculturalism, where there is an identity crisis about how this can be sustainable. The same as with secularization. Now that we jettison religion, what are we going to do with people who remain religious? I mean, religious freedom has been a very contentious issue in the last few years for that very reason. Another example would be the demography bomb. So scholars and thinkers like Louise Perry, a brilliant British thinker, she's just written a piece talking about moderns, that is to say people who are more secular, not religious, they're not reproducing. And so what do we do when we have Pew research that says people, in terms of what they value, what they consider very important is increasingly money, and decreasingly in the last 25 years, children and patriotism. So put all that together, it's getting quite messy, and things are changing pretty rapidly.
Yeah, that's right. And so a lot of people who might be considered to be allies of those of us perhaps on the centre-right of politics would perhaps not be buying into those narratives, particularly as they affect morality and community. So they'd be highlighting the individual. So this idea that I guess came from John Stuart Mill, that you can do whatever you like so long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. That seems to be a fairly animating idea of classical liberalism. But I think what I hear Peterson doing is pushing back on that idea and saying, no, family is important, community is important. The stories that bind us together, which are the religious stories, the Christian stories, are also important. And we've got to find, he uses terms like collective, as we saw in that earlier clip. That seems to be upsetting those who think that we can forge a future through radical individual autonomy.
That's right, because when people hear collectivism, they think of the horrific, tyrannical governments and movements of the 20th century, and rightly so. I mean, those are collectivist movements. But I think that we have to be careful, because what collectively binds us and unites us in a national narrative doesn't have to be tyrannical. It can be something very virtuous, and I would say that the Christian tradition is that which has sustained the West, and that's what Peterson is recognising. So I think that's where I said that Roger Partridge was, I think, in merely characterising Peterson's collectivism as being that which enables these despotic regimes, I think is incomplete. I give the example of Lee Kuan Yew, which is a case which you couldn't extrapolate across every country or civilization, but my point in raising him without defending his methods is just to say Lee put on a pedestal the notion of order and justice, not merely ideal concepts. And so I would say that liberalism is starting to suffer from ideal concepts that don't have a greater bedrock, a greater spine. And in Lee's case, it was a rare instance of benevolent control, which, I wouldn't necessarily endorse. We're talking really about a fruitful, proven system based upon the Western Christian tradition. And without getting into the detail, it's just acknowledging that as a framework which has been the antecedent for what we now enjoy.
Yeah, so what you're saying and what I hear Peterson saying, and as you said, Peterson doesn't declare whether he's a Christian or not. He's saying he's drawing truths from the Bible stories, the narratives, the archetypes, as he calls them. But what I think I hear you and Peterson saying is that we can't continue on this trajectory where we have this sort of hollowed out version of individualism without community, without family, without virtue, without character. And that just seems to lead to, a kind of hedonism that is very unfulfilling and is not the basis on which we can create a just society.
Yeah, because people confuse freedom with license. And I think that's where we're starting to get into some of the difficulties of our time, where people will look at freedom and they'll think that as to be unbridled, do whatever I like sort of freedom. But that has not been the historical definition of freedom. In fact, all the way back to Thomas Aquinas, freedom was the ability to have the space and to reflect upon what your gifts and talents are, and to think about how you can use those to serve your neighbour.
The freedom not to do what I want, but to do what I ought in the context of the community that I'm a part of.
Indeed, in that community-grounded approach to things, and that's right. That has been a definition of freedom that has fallen out of favour, particularly probably since the 1960s. We've just gotten more embroiled in these kind of liberating, kind of emancipating tendencies from institutional life. But what those things bring is a sense of ordered freedom, where you find what you're good at and you find a bigger story and embed yourself within a community so that you can serve other people and be fulfilled, live a life of richness and fruitfulness. And that is deeply satisfying. And that's what Peterson knows, because as a clinical psychologist, he has seen all the hard cases and all of the ups and downs of human experience. And he's giving a kind of intellectual credibility to say, this is what happens when you depart from these frameworks and these virtues. And if institutions aren't cultivating people within them, then you are suffering from this kind of tendency towards licentiousness, which really destroys people. And
No, Rohan, I think that's absolutely brilliant. This is the sort of conversation that we should be having in a long-form podcast, not on a ADH TV normal regular format. But I'm really glad you've been able to come on and just share some brief insights. I'd encourage everyone to go to johnanderson.net.au and watch the incredible conversations that the former Deputy Prime Minister produces, and you're part of that production. Rohan, really appreciate it. And people, of course, can go and Google your article at The Australian, Google Rohan McHugh and Jordan Peterson, you'll find it there. Rohan, thanks so much for your time, and wish you a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Lyle. Thank you very much indeed.